It's a pleasure to have you here, Professor. Thank you. The first question is, how important is the ICHoLS XIII being held in Vila and in Portugal for the first time?
Well, first of all, is the fact that this is already the 13th edition of the International Conference on the History of the Language Sciences, which shows that in fact there is interest, and in fact growing interest in the discipline. Growing because you see that the number of participants has increased, has constantly increased. Now, with respect to the Portugal situation, the fact that it's held here in Vila, I think it's a very important event. It shows and it confirms, in fact, the interest which has grown considerably in Portugal as well as in Spain, by the way. Two countries which in, let's say, the past 20 years, and maybe for Portugal especially the last 10 years, have invested a lot in terms of projects, in terms of doctoral dissertations, have invested a lot in the discipline. And so I think it's really splendid that this 13th edition, which is so well attended, takes place here, and I hope it will have also outside of Vila, so thinking of Porto, of Lisboa, Oporto and Lisboa, that it will have a vitalizing effect also on research over there.
What is your opinion until now about the communications and the Congress itself?
So if I just have to speak about what happened today, so there was the opening session, which was quite impressive, and then we had the first plenary talk, which was quite interesting because it dealt with, I think, something important for our business, for our endeavor, namely what we would call I will speak about it next Wednesday at a round table, the sustainability of our discipline. So the fact that we have to attract students, show them the importance of history or historiography of linguistics. So that was a very interesting talk. And otherwise, we had just one afternoon session, a part of one afternoon session. So I attended 3 consecutive lectures, which were of high quality. So with respect to that, I think historiography of linguistics has really attained a degree of maturity. So it can really be considered a full-blown scientific discipline. If you speak about the Congress organization up to now, I was quite impressed by the almost perfection, I would say, of the organization. So everything has been so well prepared. There is the magnificent conference handbook. So I can only speak out of admiration for you people here in para vosotros aqui em Vila Real.
The next question
Cumprimentos.
Cumprimentos. Related with the mistaken, people often mistake history of linguistics with historical linguistics. Why do you think that happened?
Why this happened? Well, it's normally, I mean, if you look at it very rationally, there should not be a confusion. But you should not forget the fact that precisely in historical linguistics, there is, or there has been, more sensitivity towards the history of the discipline, so the history of historical linguistics. So, in fact, when we speak about history of linguistics, we speak, for instance, about particular laws, so Grimm's law, Werner's law, etc. And so people who practice historical linguistics or historical comparative linguistics have, I would say, almost by nature, more sensitivity. So this may be an underlying factor, but otherwise, in fact, you should keep them apart. There are also separate congresses or conferences. You have conferences on historical linguistics, and you have conferences on history of linguistics or historical linguistics. Now, one thing which, in fact, may be also a contributing factor is that there is, of course, something in between, which is what we call history of language, Historia da lingua, which is somewhat midway between the two, because if you speak about the history of history of a language, of course there has been a very important contribution by, for instance, lexicographers or institutions which have produced dictionaries, grammars, etc. So history of language has also been shaped by people, by particular figures who are important in the history of linguistics. So it may be also because of, I would say, this midfield between the two, the midfield constituted by history of a language, that you have sometimes people who propose a paper for a conference which is on the history of linguistics, while they are speaking more about language history and something more in the field of historical linguistics. So that may be also an explanation.
As you know, Portuguese is not yet considered a scientific language, but we have 200 million of speakers, and we have ICHoLS right now in Villarreal. That's probably we're going to be a scientific language in the future.
I think so. So what will be important is that, for instance, Spanish. Of course, Spanish is also a big international language in terms of number of speakers, but Spanish has acquired easily this status, and I think Portuguese, in terms of number of speakers, certainly deserves it. So I would say my advice: speak it devagar. If you speak it slowly, it will pass as an international language. But it's so difficult. So eu também he estudado português, mas quando falais português tão rápido, não entendo, não compreendo. Por favor, faz favor, falar um pouco devagarinho. Then it will become certainly an international language, and so it's certainly a language which is suited for international conferences.
You said in the first question that I made for you, there is a increasing interest, but political, in the terms of the political field, the governments do not increase or do not have interest for the humanities, especially for the linguistics. How you think will be in the future? There is a more probably of increasing or not?
That's difficult to answer. So, I think the general tendency at the governmental level would certainly be more in favor of, I would say, developments in technology, developments in what you could call healthcare, and which to some extent I understand, because after all it's more important to save a life, to say it that way, than to talk about a grammarian of the 19th century. But so at the governmental level, I would say the general attitude of politicians or the institutional leaders, the general attitude, I would say, of the public is certainly not in favor of, I would say, pushing more cultural sciences, humanities, with respect to, I would say, more practically oriented disciplines. Now, there is, of course, the other question, which is at the level of university policy, the policy of, for instance, funding instances. I think there normally, so I'm now speaking about the situation in Belgium and so more specifically the universities I know, so Leuven, Liège, there is always the principle that there should be, I would say, a reasonable amount of funding which is completely, exclusively reserved for humanities. And so there is, I would say, an established proportion which is fixed and which is reserved for humanities. So at that level, I don't think that the situation is really that dramatic. But of course, it may be that due to higher level pressures that also this situation may change. But I'm not too pessimistic, I would say. Okay?
Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome.
Muito obrigada.
Muito obrigada a vosotros. Ok.